The snow had begun falling before dawn, thin as sifted flour over the sleeping town of Holbrook. By morning, the roofs were white and still, each house dressed in hush. Smoke curled up from crooked chimneys like lazy ghosts, and the bell atop St. Callista's chapel rang soft through the frost. 3 notes only, a slow and low beginning to another small-town Sabbath. Miriam Evers moved through the drift behind her cabin with the kind of caution born from both age and memory. Her boots pressed careful prints in the powder, and her breath came in soft clouds. She wasn't frail, not exactly. There was still strength in her spine, in her long, brown fingers that had caught babies and stitched wounds and stirred broth thick with sage. But she moved like someone aware of the weight of 60 winters. Some burdens, once worn long enough, grow into the bone. Inside her cabin, the fire snapped in its stone belly. The walls were lined with books and jars and folded quilts. A woven cradle hung from the rafters by a rope, empty now, and meant only for plants in spring. But it swayed gently in the warm air, creaking like something trying to remember music. Miriam set her basket down and lit a second lamp, though it was morning. Light came late this time of year, and even when arrived, it was pale as skimmed milk. She stood for a long time near the fire, one hand on the curve of her belly. It was not large yet, but it was undeniable. She had tried, at first, to explain it away. Strange foods, a stomach too tired for salt, the faintness that came like a feather brushing past her mind. But in truth, Miriam Evers had delivered near 100 children in her life, had caught their first cries in her own rough palms. She knew what it meant when the body quieted to listen inward. She was pregnant. There was no man, no scandal in the shadows, no lover slipping through midnight like a character in some penny novel. It was simply a happening, a mystery, a thing that defied time and reason, but not, somehow, her heart. When she had walked into Dr. Bain's office 2 weeks ago, she had told him with the same calm she'd used all her life to ease laboring women, "I believe I am with child." He had laughed at first, then looked at her again, run his hand through his white hair, performed the exam twice, then a third time, his brow pulled tight as a drawstring. "You're not wrong," he'd said finally, voice cracked like dry leather. "But I don't understand it." Neither did she. But understanding had never been a requirement for grace. And that's what it felt like, this quiet life inside her. Not punishment, not curse, a gift. Still, the town did not see it that way. By Tuesday, word had reached the feed store. By Friday, it was in the pews and the post office, bouncing between lips that knew how to smile while cutting like knives. Old fool, trying to hold on to something long gone. It ain't natural, ain't decent neither. Miriam heard them. She always had. There was a sharpness in small-town air, invisible but ever-present, like iron filings that cling to the skin. Some folks were kind, of course. Eliza May, who used to play on Miriam's floor while her mother bled through childbirth upstairs, had come by with a jar of preserves and eyes too wide for comfort. But most folks just looked away, or looked too long. At the general store, Mrs. Runnels handed her change without touching her palm. Her son Jacob, who'd once brought Miriam flowers after her husband's funeral and asked her awkward questions about life and grief, now spat near her feet as she walked past. "It's a lie," someone said once, not quite out of earshot. "She's just fat. Or mad." And still, the child moved. She could feel it sometimes, not as a kick, not yet. More like a ripple in still water, a presence, a whisper of becoming. She found herself talking to it in the quiet of evenings. Not aloud, always, but with the mind's voice. She told the stories, about her husband's kindness, about the way the creek sounded in spring, about the cottonwood trees that bloomed like clouds. She promised it would be loved, even if the world didn't know how. One night, with the snow heavy against the windows and the lantern low, Miriam fainted. It happened suddenly, in the middle of sweeping ashes from the hearth. The room tilted. Her knees gave way. She awoke some minutes later with her cheek pressed to the rug and the taste of copper in her mouth. She rose slowly, dazed but determined. She told no one. But the next morning, She walked to town for the second time that week. Dr. Baines checked her with shaking hands. Said she needed rest. Said her body was remarkable, but tested. Said kindly, but hesitantly, "There are limits, Miriam." She smiled at him. That old, tired smile people, where when they've heard every variation of "you can't" for too long. On her way home, the sky turned. Clouds gathered low, gray and swollen. The wind picked up, tossing flakes sideways. A child from the schoolhouse stared at her belly with round, frightened eyes. That night, someone knocked over the woodpile and trampled her herbs. The tracks were small, too small for boots. Just boys, probably, still learning how cruelty and fear were sometimes the same thing. She didn't chase them, didn't scold. She simply stood in the doorway and watched the snow cover their footsteps. And when she turned to go inside, she whispered something to the child within her, just a single word. Soon, the cradle above the fire creaked softly. The wind tugged at the shutters like a restless friend. And far off, beyond the hills, a rider was making his way through the storm. Still days away, still unknown, but coming. Yes, coming. The snow did not melt, not even by New Year's. It settled deeper instead, like a silence that would not lift, and the town of Holbrook wore it like a secret no one wished to name. Paths turned narrow and cautious. Windows steamed with breath and half-shut curtains. There was no laughter in the square anymore, only the creak of wagon wheels and the low groan of wood stretching beneath the cold. Miriam Evers stepped out of a chapel before the final hymn could rise. Her steps were deliberate, her hands folded beneath her shawl. She had once sat front row, her voice strong, her prayers constant. But now she slipped in late and left early. Not from shame, no, not that, but from something older, a weariness of being stared at by those who once called her neighbor. Behind her, the preacher paused mid-sentence. The door clicked shut. The murmurs began before she even reached the bottom step. She looks thinner. No, bigger. It's growing. A fool's miracle, that's what it is. She's cursed. That's the truth of it. She heard them, but they no longer stung like they had in the beginning. Rumors were like winter wind. They only hurt if you stood still and let them. So Miriam kept moving, past the bakery with its stale warmth, past the blacksmith's where the sparks had gone out for the Sabbath, past the Runnels' house where the porch was swept clean, but the soul of the place had long turned sour. Jacob Runnels stood in the yard, arms crossed, hat low over his brow. He was built like a fence post, square and hard-eyed. 10 years younger than Miriam, but aged poorly in the heart. They had shared something once, brief and unfinished. He had comforted her after her husband's death, bringing her meat and long silences that felt, for a time, like kindness. But Jacob had wanted gratitude to bloom into submission. When it hadn't, he had walked away and let bitterness rot where love might have been. Now, as she passed, he spat into the snow. "You should have stayed in the grave with your husband," he said, not loud, but loud enough. Miriam did not stop. She walked on, slower, perhaps, but upright. She passed Eliza May near the post office. The younger woman paused, face pink with cold and conflict. She had been a child in Miriam's arms once, after a fall off a horse and a broken wrist. Now she clutched a basket and the sleeve of her husband's coat. "Eliza," Miriam said softly, a kind greeting, a remembered bond. But Eliza's eyes flicked to the man beside her, and she said nothing, just turned her face and kept walking. It hurt more than Jacob's venom. Kindness left unsaid often did. At home, Miriam lit the stove and sat near the fire. The baby shifted beneath her ribs like a swallow in a storm. She rubbed the swell of her belly, humming tunelessly. The days were colder now, but her child gave off a strange warmth, like candlelight from within. She had begun writing again. Not letters now, but names, testing them out like prayers. Some were old, some borrowed from her books, others plucked from dreams. She wrote them in a little notebook with faded corners and a spine that creaked. A girl or a boy, it did not matter. Only that the name fit like a second skin, gentle and sure. The knocking came near dusk. 3 raps. Then 2 more. She opened the door slowly, expecting the preacher, perhaps, or a brave neighbor with an offering of soup and caution. But instead it was two boys, barely more than children, their cheeks red from the cold, eyes bright with something they didn't yet understand. One of them held a rock. The other carried a folded piece of paper. Miriam said nothing. The boy with the rock dropped it. The one with the paper held it out. "We were told to," he muttered. She didn't take it. Instead, she looked past them to the darkening road, the footprints behind them filling with fresh snow. She nodded once. "Go on home now," she said, voice soft as flannel. "Tell whoever sent you that I read hearts better than paper." They left without another word. The note tumbled into the snow. Wind uncurled it like a dried petal. One word scrawled in dark ink, which, later that evening, Miriam sat at the table, her hands around a chipped mug of tea. She did not cry. Tears required surprise, and none of this surprised her anymore. What stayed with her wasn't the note. It was the look in that boy's eyes, guilt, fear, something yet unformed. The way his hands had trembled despite his mission. That was where her sorrow lived, not in the cruelty, but in the way it was passed down like a sickness. She leaned back and closed her eyes, and slowly, as if summoned by her stillness, a memory stirred. Her husband's voice, long buried but never gone, echoing from some tucked-away place. "You've always carried life where others saw loss, Mim. That's your gift, even when it costs you." She touched her belly again, fingertips featherlight. "I won't hide you," she whispered. "Not for them. Not ever." The fire sighed in the hearth. The cradle above swayed once. And outside, the snow began again, soft and unrelenting. Far beyond town, beyond fields silvered with frost, a rider moved along the distant ridge. He traveled without haste, as though drawn not by urgency, but by purpose. In his pocket were pages yellowed by time, and in his eyes, the slow glint of something long buried but not lost. Holbrook did not yet know he was coming, but the wind seemed to know. And Miriam, though she could not name it yet, felt the world begin to shift. It was the second thaw that fooled Holbrook. A thin spell of sun in midwinter, melting icicles till they wept like grieving women, coaxing the creek to whisper again beneath its crust of frost. But it was false warmth, the kind that tricked even birds into song before silencing them once more with another hard freeze. Miriam stood at the window, one hand on the frame, the other resting over the slow, round bloom of her belly. The light touched her face and hair gently, as if apologizing for what the world had done. Then she saw him, a rider on the eastern ridge, his figure small against the bone-white stretch of sky. Not rushing, not weaving, just steady, like a man who'd been traveling long enough to know that roads were patient things. The horse was dark, its breath misting in rhythm with its hooves. The man wore no hat, though the cold bit deep, and he sat straight despite the way one leg stiffened each time the mount descended a slope. She watched until the trees took him. It was hours before he reached her land, the sun already falling behind the low hills, spilling amber into the snow like spilled oil from a dying lantern. She heard the soft crunch of hoofsteps first, then the gate creak, a sound she hadn't heard in weeks. She opened the door before he knocked. He stood there, tall but tired, wrapped in a coat patched at the shoulder. His hair was dark with streaks of gray, and windburn reddened the angles of his cheeks. He did not smile, but neither did he flinch when he saw her. "Evenin', ma'am," he said, voice low, rough from dust or silence. "My horse threw a shoe 2 miles back. I saw your light." His eyes drifted to her belly, paused there, then lifted back to hers. No comment, no question, just a seeing. Quiet, clean. "Come in," Miriam said. He stepped through the doorway like he'd done it before, though he left the cold behind him like someone who knew it well. She poured him water. He drank slowly, hands trembling just slightly. Age or hunger, she couldn't tell. "I've stew," she said after a pause. "It's not much, but that'd be welcome." They ate with few words between them, the silence companionable, not stiff. He didn't ask about the baby. She didn't ask his name. But later, as she spread an extra quilt over the small cot near the hearth, he spoke. Elijah, he said. Cole. She nodded, not pressing. The way his voice caught told her enough, that the name meant more than just letters strung together, that it held a story folded tight against it, still too bruised to unfold. When she offered him the barn, he shook his head. This'll do, he said, hand resting briefly on the back of the chair, steadying himself. Miriam didn't argue. That night, long after the fire had settled into its red heart and the wind returned to tapping at the windows like a lonely child, she heard him rise. The soft creak of floorboards, the scrape of a chair moved aside. She stayed quiet. He didn't leave, just stood for a while near the cradle hanging above the hearth, watching it sway slightly, as if the memory of a child had stirred it. The next morning, he was outside before her. She stepped out with a shawl wrapped tight, breath fogging the air. He was near the broken fence post by the herb garden, kneeling, hammer in hand. The rails were aligned with care. No urgency, just precision. You don't have to, she said. Elijah glanced up, eyes the color of creek water after snow. I know, he said. By noon, the fence was whole again. He stayed 3 days. Slept near the fire. Ate sparingly. Rode into town once. Returned with a new shoe for the horse and a small sack of flour he laid on her table, without a word. Miriam didn't ask where the coin came from. She suspected it cost him more than he could spare. The townsfolk, of course, noticed. By the second day, whispers ran like mice under the floorboards of Holbrook. He's with her. Drifter. You know what they are. She's drawing in strays now like a curse. Someone scratched Sinner into her gatepost in the dark. Elijah sanded it off the next morning. That afternoon, she found him sketching near the creek, his knees drawn up, a book balanced on one thigh. The pages held soft pencil strokes, landscapes, trees, the shape of her cabin. But there was one drawing that made her pause, a small hand, palm open, fingers curled as if about to grasp something unseen. Your child, she asked, sitting on a stone nearby. He nodded once. A daughter. Long ago. There was no grief in his tone, just the evenness of someone who had lived with loss long enough for it to become part of the rhythm of breath. I buried her before she breathed, he said, and my wife not long after. Miriam looked down at her own hands, so similar in shape to the one in the drawing. Her belly shifted, the life within turning slowly, a moon in its own quiet orbit. I never had one, she said. Not with him. We tried, but... The wind stirred the branches overhead, shaking loose a few pale needles of ice. I think, she continued, I stopped believing it was even mine to want. Elijah closed the sketchbook gently. Then it came anyway, he said. She didn't respond. Just let the silence bloom between them, wide and bare and strangely comforting. That night, when the wind howled so hard it rattled the shutters, she lit a second fire. He sat across from her, one hand resting on the table, the other curled loosely around a mug of something warm. They want me gone, she said after a long while. Not with words, not all of them, but with eyes, with silence. They think it's wrong, that it's a mockery. Elijah didn't look away. They don't know what they're speaking on. She met his gaze, steady and solemn. I don't want this child to grow up hiding. He leaned forward slightly, the fire casting long shadows across his cheekbones. Then don't hide. His words were not defiant, just certain, like stone placed in soil, ready for whatever weather came. Later, as she turned in for the night, she paused beside the hearth where the cradle swayed. A new warmth had entered her home, not of romance, not yet, but of steadiness, of shared silence, of the rarest kind of mercy, being seen without being judged. Outside, the snow thickened again, blanketing Holbrook beneath its indifferent hush. And still, the fire inside her cabin did not falter, nor did the man who now sat beside it. It was on the 5th night, after supper, with snow tapping soft lullabies against the window panes, that Elijah rose from his place at the hearth and asked if he might mend the loose floorboard near the bed. It lifts when I walk, he said, his voice quiet, respectful. Miriam nodded. Been like that since the first frost this year. I meant to fix it. He fetched his tools without fuss, kneeling with the ease of someone who'd once done such things often, back when hands were younger and days were longer. She busied herself by the stove, watching the kettle steam, letting the clatter of nails and soft scrape of wood fill the silence between them. But the floorboard wasn't empty beneath. As Elijah pried it up, his brow furrowed. There, tucked inside a linen pouch, lay a collection of papers, worn at the edges, folded with care. They smelled of cedar and thyme. He hesitated. Then, gently, he pulled one free. The handwriting was hers, fine and deliberate, like each word had cost something to say. He didn't read them all, just one. It began, without preamble. To the child I've waited for longer than most women wait to die. Miriam turned then, caught by the change in air. She saw the paper in his hand, saw the look on his face, not shame, not intrusion, but something else. Reverence, perhaps. A solemn respect. "I didn't mean to," he began. "It's all right," she said softly. "They're not secrets. Not anymore." She came to sit beside him, the kettle forgotten, the fire low. "They're letters," she explained. "For the child. Before the world has a chance to tell her who she is. I wanted her to hear it from me first." Elijah nodded, folding the paper as if it were something sacred. "I've never read anything so quiet," he said after a while. "Like you were whispering through paper." She smiled, thin and tired. "There were nights I needed to believe she could hear me." They replaced the letters gently, sealing them back under the board as though tucking away a lullaby. The room felt different after that, heavier, yet warmer, as if the truth had settled in and found a place to sit. The next day, Holbrook's silence cracked a little wider. Word had reached the council. 3 men with stern mouths and hands that had never held anything as fragile as faith. They sent a letter, unsigned but clear. Miriam was to vacate by spring thaw. Her land, they said, was a place of confusion and discord. They worded it as concern, but the venom was plain. She read it at the table while Elijah stood beside her. "What will you do?" he asked. "I'll stay," she answered. "I'll plant potatoes and lay out my herbs like I always have. Let them try to move me." He didn't argue, just reached over and set a hand on hers, rough and steady. That night, she dreamed of a little girl with curls like willow branches and a laugh that sounded like wind through tall grass. When she woke, there were tears on her cheeks. Miriam rose earlier than usual the next morning and found Elijah already at work in the snow, hammering wood, measuring lengths, his breath hanging in the cold like ribbon. "What is it?" she asked, stepping down from the porch. He glanced up, smiled just a little. "Cradle. But we already. This one's for the sunroom," he said, "so she can sleep near the window, where light comes first." She didn't speak, just watched him work, the way his hands moved, slow and patient. Not crafting furniture, she realized, but making room. In his way, he was saying what words couldn't hold. She brought him coffee in a tin cup. He took it with a grateful nod. And for a long while, neither of them said anything at all. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something older. Something like trust. Like 2 trees that had grown beside each other long enough for their roots to tangle. By week's end, the cradle was done. Simple, strong, unvarnished. When she ran her fingers along its edge, it felt more real than anything she'd allowed herself to hope for. She placed a folded quilt inside, one she'd sewn 20 years ago, for a child who never came. That evening, Eliza May returned. She knocked hesitantly, holding a tin of dried fruit in her gloved hands. Her face was flushed, but not from cold. "I shouldn't be here," she said quickly. "Ben doesn't know I came." Miriam opened the door wider. "Come in anyway." They sat in the kitchen, the fire popping softly behind them. Eliza's hands trembled as she set down the tin. "I heard they want you gone," she said, not meeting Miriam's eyes. "And I've been quiet. Too quiet." Miriam nodded once. "You were kind once. That's never quiet." Eliza's breath hitched. "My mother used to say you were made of more than skin. She said you had a spine like a river. I think she was right." Miriam didn't reply, but her hand reached across the table, gently closing over Eliza's. The girl, No woman now looked up, tears caught like light in her lashes. "I'm afraid," Eliza whispered. "Afraid of being different. Afraid of standing beside someone they've already decided to hate." Miriam said only, "That's when you're needed most." When Eliza left, the tin was half empty, but her back was straighter than before. She did not run. Later, as the wind picked up and the sky threatened another storm, Elijah lit the lamps one by one, their glow blooming against the dark. He found Miriam by the cradle, stroking its smooth edge, humming something soft and wordless. He stood beside her. "I never expected to stay," he said after a long while. "But now I can't picture leaving." She looked up, the firelight catching the gold in her eyes. "Then don't." And in that moment, with the house warm and the world cold, with a child between them like a promise neither dared name aloud, something shifted again. Not loudly, just enough to hold. The final snow came sudden and thick, dropping from a pale sky with a soundless certainty of endings. By mid-morning, the cabin's roof wore a deep white crown, and the road into town vanished beneath the drifts like a forgotten path. The air was dense, the kind of stillness that came before a storm declared its true name. Miriam had been feeling the change for days, not in the sky, but in her body. A heaviness low and rhythmic, not pain yet, but something preparing. The child shifted more often, like it too, was trying to find its place in a world not yet ready to receive it. She stood at the window while Elijah chopped wood outside, each swing of the axe sharp and sure, as if he were splitting more than timber. His coat was dusted white, his breath puffing in quick clouds. He had not spoken much the past 2 days, but his presence had grown deeper, more rooted, as though some decision had taken hold in him. When he came in, shaking snow from his shoulders, she noticed his silence wasn't emptiness. It was gathering. A man building toward something. "You're pacing again," he said gently. "I can't help it. She's restless." He tilted his head. "You say she like you know for certain." Miriam smiled, tired and soft. "Some things you don't have to be told." They spent the afternoon preparing things that were already prepared. Quilts refolded, jars checked, the cradle redusted. She lit candles early, the sky dim by 4. The fire popped like applause in a quiet theater. Still, there was a weight in the room, something unsaid between them. It came loose just before dusk. "I wasn't always a drifter," Elijah said, his voice low, as he sat sharpening a knife that hadn't seen use in weeks. "Wasn't always a man who rode away from things." Miriam looked up from her stitching. She didn't speak, only waited. "I was a doctor once. Back east. Not a fancy one, not rich. Just careful. I delivered babies. Sewed up wounds. Held the dying. Same as any man of medicine in a town too small to have more than one." He paused, steel flashing against stone. "There was a girl. 17. Too young. Labor went bad. Father was a judge, a big man in a small pond. When the child died, he needed someone to blame. Her too, I think, but mostly me." The fire cracked. "I was told I'd made a mistake," he continued. "But I hadn't. Not the kind they accused me of. I'd just been there, holding the grief when no one else would. But the story turned, and I was cast out." Miriam set her sewing aside. Her hands found her lap, fingers folding into one another. "They ruined my name, my license, my wife. She couldn't live with the shame. And then I was alone, just a man with a saddle and too many regrets." He looked up, and she saw not guilt, but weariness. The kind that comes from living honestly in a world that punishes honesty. "And now?" she asked. He gave a faint, rueful smile. "Now I build cradles and ride wherever shame hasn't quite caught up." Silence filled the space between them. It wasn't cold. It wasn't painful. It was just wide, like breath drawn before speaking a truth. "You came to the right place, Elijah Cole," Miriam said finally. "Because shame lives here too, but it doesn't win." That night, the storm came hard. Wind howled around the eaves. Trees groaned like old bones. Snow battered the windows until they trembled in their frames. And sometime near midnight, Miriam cried out. It wasn't dramatic, not a scream, just a breath caught wrong, a hand pressed firm against her belly, and then another cry, sharp this time, unmistakable. Elijah was up in an instant. "It's time," she gasped, gripping the edge of the table. He steadied her, his hands firm beneath her arms, guiding her to the bed. The cradle swayed nearby, empty still, expectant. Sweat beaded on her brow. Her body, worn from years of waiting, now surged with a power she had long forgotten it could summon. He moved with practiced calm, fetching towels, boiling water, spreading sheets like ritual. Not a tremble in him. Not a pause. She gritted her teeth. "You've done this before." "More times than I remember," he said, kneeling beside her, eyes steady on hers. "But never for someone like you." The labor was long. Longer than it should have been. The child resisted, turned wrong, came slow. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside her body. Elijah never left her side. Once, she gripped his wrist so tightly he thought the bone might crack. She whispered prayers and curses in the same breath. She sobbed without tears. And all the while he whispered back, not instructions, not orders, just presence. "You're strong. You're not alone. She's almost here." When it happened, it was with the finality of thunder. A last push, a strangled cry. And then, a silence so profound it nearly broke them both. But then, like dawn after a long night, a cry. Sharp, small, fierce. Miriam fell back, tears streaming now, free at last. Elijah lifted the child gently, clearing her lungs, wrapping her in the old quilt. "A girl," he said softly, voice cracking for the first time. He placed her on Miriam's chest. The baby's tiny fists curled against her mother's skin, and Miriam laughed, choked, disbelieving, full of something that was more than joy. Hope. Outside, the storm began to break. Wind fell quiet. Snow slowed. And when morning came, it did so gently, light spilling through the frost-laced glass like a blessing. Word traveled fast. Eliza came first, breathless, hands full of broth and stitched cloth. Then others. A quiet line of souls bearing bread, wood, blankets. No apologies were spoken, but eyes were lowered in humility, not shame. Preacher Harlan arrived with a book in one hand and trembling fingers in the other. He asked to bless the child. Miriam let him, her eyes never leaving Elijah's face. In the days that followed, the child thrived. And so did the house. Laughter returned. So did music, drifting from Elijah's humming as he worked by the window, the child asleep nearby. No one asked him to leave. He never did. Holbrook remembered its cruelty. But it also remembered the child's first cry in the storm, and the man who helped bring her into the world with hands steady from both ruin and grace. Some whispered still, but others called it what it was, a miracle. And Miriam, standing in the doorway with her daughter in her arms and Elijah behind her, simply smiled. There are some winters, after all, that do not kill. They reveal.